The broadcast went live at 3 in the afternoon, interrupting every screen on Earth. A figure towered in the center of the UN Assembly Hall, scales shimmering like oil on water, eyes burning with ancient contempt. He called himself Kravix, warlord of the shattered chains, and he spoke in a voice that rattled windows across 6 continents. "Send me your champion," he demanded, raising a clawed hand toward the cameras. "One warrior, one duel. If they win, we leave. If they fall, your world kneels." The feed cut to black. Governments scrambled. Generals consulted. And in a small public library in Columbus, Ohio, Eleanor Marsh looked up from the returns cart, adjusted her glasses, and quietly closed the book in her lap. She had always been the kind of person people overlooked. 42 years old, unmarried, living in a one-bedroom apartment above a bakery that smelled perpetually of cinnamon and burnt sugar. She wore cardigans in soft grays and blues, kept her hair in a practical bun, and spoke only when spoken to. Her co-workers at the Riverside Branch Library knew her as reliable, meticulous, and remarkably good at finding obscure references. No one knew she had spent the last 15 years translating dead languages in her spare time, or that she had memorized entire passages from texts so old they predated most known civilizations. No one knew because she had never told them. Eleanor had learned early that the world did not reward the quiet, so she became very good at being useful without being noticed. The news played on a small television behind the circulation desk. A panel of experts debated who might represent humanity. Names were floated: Olympic athletes, mixed martial artists, a decorated Navy SEAL who had survived 3 tours and written a best-selling memoir. Eleanor listened as she shelved books, her fingers tracing the spines absently. She paused at a section on ancient philosophy, pulled a volume, and flipped to a dog-eared page. The words were in a script few could read, a dialect that had died with the Library of Alexandria. She read them silently, her lips barely moving, and then she set the book down and walked to her supervisor's office. "I need to take personal time," Eleanor said. Her supervisor, a round-faced woman named Janet who had worked there for 30 years, looked up from her computer. "Now, Eleanor, we're short-staffed as it is. I understand, I'm sorry." Eleanor's voice was calm, steady. "But I need to go to New York." Janet frowned. "Is everything okay?" Eleanor hesitated. She could have lied. She could have invented a sick relative or a family emergency. Instead, she said, "I'm going to volunteer for the duel." Janet stared at her. Then she laughed, a short, nervous sound. "Eleanor, that's not funny." "I know." Eleanor turned and walked out before Janet could say anything else. The train to New York took 8 hours. Eleanor sat by the window, reading. The book was small, bound in cracked leather, and written in a language that had no name. She had found it years ago in an estate sale, buried in a box of moldy hymnals and outdated encyclopedias. The seller had wanted $5 for the whole lot. Eleanor had paid $20 and carried the box home on the bus, her heart racing with the kind of excitement she rarely allowed herself to feel. She had spent months deciphering the text, cross-referencing fragments with obscure linguistic databases and forgotten academic papers. What she found was a treatise on the nature of thought itself, written by a civilization that had mastered the manipulation of consciousness long before humanity had discovered fire. The duel was set for 3 days from now. That gave the world 72 hours to decide who would fight. The UN had issued a global call for candidates. Thousands had applied. Eleanor had not. She simply boarded a train, carrying nothing but a small backpack and the book. When she arrived at Grand Central, the city was in chaos. Military checkpoints lined the streets. Helicopters circled overhead. Crowds gathered in Times Square, watching live feeds of the alien ship hovering above the Atlantic. Eleanor walked through it all with the same quiet determination she brought to everything. She made her way to the UN building, where a line of hopefuls stretched around the block. Soldiers in body armor stood at the entrance, checking IDs and turning people away. Eleanor joined the line. The woman in front of her was young, maybe 25, with the kind of build that suggested years of serious training. She wore a jacket with patches from various dojos and held herself like someone who had spent her life learning how to hurt people efficiently. She glanced at Eleanor, then looked away, dismissing her. Eleanor did not mind. She was used to it. When Eleanor reached the front of the line, a soldier stopped her. Name and credentials. Eleanor Marsh, I'm here to volunteer. The soldier looked at her, then at his clipboard. You're not on the list. I didn't apply through official channels. Then you can't be here. Step aside, ma'am. Eleanor stayed where she was. I'd like to speak to someone in charge. Ma'am, we have over 10,000 applicants. Unless you have clearance or a military record, you're wasting everyone's time. Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out the book. She opened it to a marked page and held it up. The text shimmered faintly in the fluorescent light. This is a cognitive disruptor. It's a weapon older than any government on this planet. If you let me through, I can explain. The soldier stared at her. Then he radioed someone. 5 minutes later, Eleanor was escorted inside. She was taken to a conference room on the 12th floor, where a panel of officials sat behind a long table. There were generals, scientists, a representative from the Secretary General's office, and a woman in a crisp suit who introduced herself as Dr. Anya Patel, head of the UN's newly formed Extraterrestrial Contact Division. They all looked exhausted. They all looked at Eleanor like she was another problem they did not have time for. Ms. Marsh, Dr. Patel said, folding her hands on the table, you have 2 minutes to explain why we shouldn't have you removed from this building. Eleanor set the book on the table. Kravix isn't interested in physical combat. He's a psychic predator. His species conquered 47 worlds by breaking their champions mentally before the first blow was ever struck. He'll enter your fighter's mind, twist their thoughts, turn their strength into fear. Every candidate you've screened is trained to fight with their body. None of them are prepared for what he'll do to their mind. One of the generals leaned forward. And you are. I've studied cognitive warfare for 15 years. I've translated texts from civilizations that understood consciousness as a battlefield. I know how to defend against psychic intrusion. More than that, I know how to counter it. Dr. Patel picked up the book, flipped through a few pages, then set it down. This is gibberish. It's Proto-Sumeric overlaid with a symbolic cipher, Eleanor said. The text describes a technique for creating mental feedback loops. If Kravix tries to invade my thoughts, I can reflect his attack back into his own mind. It's not about strength. It's about structure. A scientist in a white coat spoke up. Even if that's true, you're not a trained fighter. He could kill you physically before you get a chance to use it. He won't, Eleanor said quietly. He'll go for the mind first. That's how he wins. That's how he's always won. The room fell silent. Dr. Patel exchanged glances with the others. Finally, she said, we have professional soldiers, Olympians, people who have dedicated their lives to combat. Why should we send a librarian? Eleanor met her gaze. Because a soldier will try to fight him. I'll try to understand him. And understanding is how you win wars that can't be won with fists. They deliberated for an hour. Eleanor waited in the hallway, sitting on a bench, reading. When they called her back in, Dr. Patel looked grim. We're going to run tests, psychological evaluations. If you pass and if no one else proves more qualified, we'll consider it. But I need you to understand something, Ms. Marsh. If we send you out there and you fail, humanity loses everything. Eleanor nodded. I understand. The tests began the next morning. Psychologists probed her mind with hypotheticals and stress scenarios. Neurologists hooked her up to machines that measured her brain waves under duress. They subjected her to sensory deprivation, simulated fear responses, and cognitive overload exercises. Eleanor endured it all with the same quiet patience she brought to everything. She answered every question honestly. She did not flinch when they showed her images designed to provoke panic. She did not break when they isolated her in a dark room for 6 hours. At the end of it, the lead psychologist sat across from her and said, "You have the most stable cognitive baseline I've ever seen. It's almost unnatural." Eleanor smiled faintly. "I've had a lot of practice being calm." "Why?" She hesitated. Then she said, "When I was 12, my mother died, cancer. My father couldn't handle it. He drank. A lot. I learned early that the best way to survive was to stay quiet, stay small, and never let anyone see what I was feeling. After a while, it became second nature. The psychologist wrote something down, and you think that makes you qualified for this?" Eleanor looked at her. "I think it means I know how to survive in a place where most people would break. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that survival isn't about being the strongest. It's about being the one who refuses to give up." 2 days later, they made their decision. Eleanor would fight. The announcement went out at noon. The internet exploded. People called it a joke, a publicity stunt, a death sentence. Eleanor did not read the comments. She spent the day before the duel in her hotel room reviewing the book, memorizing passages, and running through mental exercises. She ate a simple dinner. She slept soundly. The morning of the duel, she dressed in her usual clothes, a gray cardigan, a white blouse, dark slacks, and her glasses. She braided her hair. She slipped the book into a small messenger bag. When the escort came to take her to the arena, she was ready. The duel was held in the middle of Central Park. The area had been cleared, cordoned off by military barricades. A platform had been constructed in the center of the great lawn, raised high enough that the cameras could capture every angle. Millions watched from screens around the world. Eleanor walked to the platform alone, her footsteps steady, her face calm. Kravix was already there, waiting. He was larger in person than he had appeared on the broadcast. 10 feet tall, his body covered in interlocking scales that shifted colors like a prism. His eyes were black, depthless, and when he looked at Eleanor, she felt the weight of something ancient and hungry. He smiled, revealing rows of serrated teeth. "This is your champion." His voice was a low rumble, vibrating through the ground. A fragile thing in cloth and glass. Eleanor stopped a few feet from him. She set her bag down, pulled out the book, and held it at her side. "I'm what you asked for." Kravix laughed. The sound was like stones grinding together. "I have broken warriors whose names are sung across galaxies. I have shattered empires with a thought, and you think you can stand against me?" Eleanor adjusted her glasses. "I think you're afraid." The laughter stopped. Kravix's eyes narrowed. "Afraid? Yes." Eleanor's voice was steady, quiet. "You demand duels because you can't win wars. You break minds because you can't break bodies. You're a predator who only hunts prey that's already afraid, and I'm not afraid of you." Kravix's expression shifted. Something flickered behind his eyes, rage, and beneath it something else. He stepped closer, looming over her. "Let me show you fear." The psychic assault hit like a freight train. Eleanor's vision blurred, the world around her dissolving into a swirl of dark shapes and whispered voices. She felt Kravix's presence in her mind, a cold, invasive force that clawed through her memories, searching for weakness. He pulled at her grief, dragging the image of her mother's hospital room to the surface, the smell of antiseptic and decay. He twisted it, made her relive the moment she had sat alone by the bedside, holding a hand that no longer squeezed back. Eleanor let him. She did not fight. Instead, she opened the book. The words on the page began to glow. Eleanor read aloud, her voice cutting through the chaos in her mind. The language was ancient, each syllable a precise tool designed to reshape thought. As she spoke, the psychic landscape shifted. The memories Kravix had weaponized began to fragment, breaking apart into harmless echoes. Eleanor wove the words together, constructing a mental architecture that reflected his attack back toward its source. She felt Kravix recoil, felt his presence falter. She kept reading. Kravix roared, the sound both physical and psychic, a wave of force that made the platform shudder. He lunged at her, claws extended, but Eleanor did not move. She spoke the final line of the passage, her voice clear and unwavering. The words hit Kravix like a hammer. His mind, designed to invade and dominate, turned inward. The feedback loop Eleanor had constructed forced him to confront his own thoughts, his own fears, the weight of every mind he had ever broken. He staggered, his massive form swaying, his eyes wide with something that looked like horror. Eleanor closed the book. She looked up at him, and in that moment she saw him for what he truly was, not a conqueror, not a warlord. Just a being who had spent so long living in the minds of others that he had forgotten what it was like to be alone with himself. "You've spent centuries breaking people," she said softly, "but you never learned how to put yourself back together." Kravix fell to his knees. His claws scraped against the platform, leaving deep gouges. His breath came in ragged gasps. Around the world, people watching the broadcast held their breath. Eleanor stepped closer, her expression gentle. "It doesn't have to end like this." Kravix looked up at her, his eyes no longer burning with contempt. They were empty, lost. "What have you done to me?" "I showed you yourself," Eleanor said. "That's all." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Kravix lowered his head. "I yield." The words echoed across the park, through the cameras, to every corner of the earth. Eleanor let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. The duel was over. Humanity had won. Kravix's ship departed within the hour, disappearing into the void without another word. The UN held a press conference. Experts analyzed what had happened. Theories were proposed, debated, dissected. Eleanor ignored all of it. She took a train back to Columbus and returned to work the next Monday. Janet greeted her at the circulation desk with wide eyes. "Eleanor, you're a hero. You're all over the news. People are calling you the greatest warrior in human history." Eleanor smiled faintly as she set her bag down. "I'm a librarian, Janet. I just read him a story." Janet laughed, shaking her head. "You're impossible, but seriously, are you okay?" That had to be traumatic. Eleanor thought about it. She thought about the cold weight of Kravix's mind pressing into hers, the memories he had dredged up, the fear he had tried to plant. And she thought about the moment he had fallen, not because she had hurt him, but because she had made him see himself. "I'm okay," she said quietly. "Better than okay, actually." Life returned to something resembling normal. The world moved on. Kravix became a footnote in history, a cautionary tale about hubris and the dangers of underestimating the quiet ones. Eleanor went back to shelving books, helping patrons find obscure references, and spending her evenings translating texts that most people would never read. But something had shifted inside her. She no longer felt invisible. She had proven, if only to herself, that quiet strength could be just as powerful as any weapon. 3 weeks after the duel, a package arrived at the library. It was addressed to Eleanor, no return address. Inside was a single piece of parchment, covered in the same script as her book. The message was short. "You spared me when you could have destroyed me. For that, I am grateful. I have disbanded my fleet. I will spend the rest of my days trying to repair what I have broken. Thank you for showing me there is another way." Eleanor read the note twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into her book. She did not show it to anyone. She simply returned to work, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. That evening, she walked home through the familiar streets of Columbus, past the bakery that still smelled like cinnamon, past the park where children played under the fading light. She stopped at a cafe she had passed 1,000 times but never entered. It was small, cozy, with warm lighting and the sound of soft jazz drifting through the open door. Eleanor hesitated, then stepped inside. She ordered a tea and sat by the window, watching the world go by. A man at the next table glanced over. He was older, maybe mid-50s, with graying hair and kind eyes. He nodded politely. "Good book." Eleanor looked down at the text in her lap. It's about understanding, she said, how sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight in our own minds. The man smiled. Sounds heavy. It is, but worth it. They talked for a while about nothing in particular, books, the weather, the strange feeling of living in a world that had almost ended but somehow kept going. When Eleanor finally left, the man called after her, "I hope you come back." Eleanor paused, looked back, and smiled. "I think I will." Over the following months, the cafe became a regular stop. Eleanor met people there. Not many and not quickly, but slowly, in the way friendships are built by people who have learned that connection is something you nurture rather than force. She started attending a book club that met on Thursday nights. She helped a college student with a research paper on ancient languages. She even went on a date with the man from the cafe, a history professor named David who had a passion for obscure civilizations and a laugh that reminded her of summer rain. It was not a grand transformation. Eleanor did not become famous. She did not seek the spotlight. But she began to live in a way she never had before. She allowed herself to be seen. She allowed herself to care. And when people asked her about the duel, as they inevitably did, she always gave the same answer. "I just did what I've always done. I read." 1 year after the duel, the UN invited Eleanor to speak at a conference on interstellar diplomacy. She declined. Instead, she stayed in Columbus, working at the library, translating her texts and living a life that felt, for the first time, entirely her own. She kept the book on a shelf in her apartment, alongside the note from Kravix, and sometimes she would take them down and reread them, reminding herself of the moment she had stood on that platform and chosen understanding over violence. The world had moved on. But Eleanor had not forgotten. She had learned that the quietest voices could carry the most weight, that the most powerful weapon was not held in a hand but carried in a heart, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply refuse to be afraid. She had learned that she was enough, and that was everything. One evening, as winter began to creep into Ohio, Eleanor sat in the cafe by the window, a cup of tea warming her hands. David sat across from her, reading a book she had recommended. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and silent, blanketing the city in white. Eleanor watched it, a small smile on her face, and thought about how strange and beautiful it was that the world could end and begin again in the space of a heartbeat. David looked up. "What are you thinking about?" Eleanor glanced at him, then back at the snow. "Second chances." He nodded, understanding without needing to ask. They sat together in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes when two people have learned to be still in each other's presence. Eleanor felt something settle inside her, something warm and quiet and entirely hers. She had spent so long being small, being invisible, being the person who stayed quiet so no one would notice. But she had also learned that smallness was not the same as weakness, that quiet was not the same as powerless, and that the world had room for people like her. People who fought with words, people who won by refusing to become what they were fighting against. The snow continued to fall. Eleanor sipped her tea, and somewhere far beyond the stars, a warlord sat alone in a ship, staring at his reflection, and wondered if he, too, could learn to be something other than what he had been. Months turned into a year, then two. Eleanor's life settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and new. She continued working at the library, but she also began teaching a class at the local community college, sharing her knowledge of ancient languages with students who were hungry to learn. She published a paper on cognitive defense mechanisms, co-authored with Dr. Patel, who had become an unexpected friend. The paper was dense, academic, and read by approximately 200 people, but Eleanor did not mind. She had never been interested in fame. David proposed on a Thursday evening in the cafe where they had first met. He did not kneel. He simply looked at her and said, "I think we should keep doing this, forever, if you're willing." Eleanor said yes without hesitation. They married in a small ceremony attended by close friends and a handful of family. Eleanor wore a simple dress, and David wore a suit that was slightly too big. Janet from the library cried. Dr. Patel gave a toast about the power of unlikely heroes. And Eleanor, standing beside the man she loved, felt a kind of happiness she had never thought possible. Life was not perfect. There were hard days. Days when the weight of what she had done caught up with her. When she woke in the middle of the night with the phantom pressure of Kravitz's mind pressing against hers. David held her on those nights and she let him, learning slowly that it was okay to need someone. She kept the book on a shelf in their bedroom, and sometimes she would read passages aloud to David, translating the ancient script into English. He listened, fascinated, and asked questions she delighted in answering. 3 years after the duel, Eleanor received another message. It arrived in the same way as the first, a package with no return address. Inside was a small, intricately carved stone, smooth and cool to the touch. The note that accompanied it was written in English this time. I have found peace. I hope you have as well. Eleanor set the stone on her desk, next to a framed photo of her and David on their wedding day. She did not need to respond. The gesture was enough. Kravitz had changed, and so had she. They had both learned that the hardest battles were the ones fought within, and that victory was not about dominance but about finding a way to live with yourself. Years passed. Eleanor grew older. Her hair turned gray, and she traded her glasses for bifocals. She retired from the library but continued teaching, finding joy in the faces of students who discovered the beauty of dead languages and forgotten texts. David retired as well, and they spent their days together, traveling to places Eleanor had only read about, visiting ancient ruins and libraries and quiet cafes in distant cities. On her 60th birthday, Eleanor stood in the ruins of the Library of Alexandria, or what remained of it. She placed her hand on a crumbling stone wall and thought about all the knowledge that had been lost, all the voices that had been silenced. And she thought about the knowledge that endured, carried forward by people like her, people who believed that words mattered, that understanding mattered, that the quietest acts of preservation could ripple through centuries. David stood beside her, his hand in hers. What are you thinking? Eleanor smiled. That we're all librarians in a way. We carry stories forward, we keep them alive. He squeezed her hand. You've kept a lot of stories alive. She looked at him, at the lines on his face, the kindness in his eyes. So have you. They stood together in the fading light, two people who had found each other in the aftermath of the world almost ending. And Eleanor thought about the girl she had been, the one who had learned to be small and quiet and invisible. She thought about the woman who had stood on a platform and faced down a warlord with nothing but a book and her voice. And she thought about the woman she was now, older, softer, still quiet but no longer small. She had learned that the most important battles were not fought with fists or weapons, but with patience, understanding, and the willingness to see the humanity in even the most monstrous of foes. She had learned that kindness was not weakness, that quiet was not powerless, and that the world needed people who chose to read instead of fight. And she had learned, most of all, that she was enough. Eleanor and David returned home to Columbus. She continued teaching until her 70s, and even after that, she never stopped translating. The book remained on her shelf, a constant companion, a reminder of the day she had changed the world by refusing to let it change her. She passed it down to a student, a young woman with sharp eyes and a quiet determination that reminded Eleanor of herself. Take care of it, Eleanor said, and if the world ever needs it again, use it wisely. The student nodded, holding the book like the precious artifact it was. I will. Eleanor lived to be 84. She died peacefully in her sleep, David beside her holding her hand. The world mourned her passing in the way it mourns all quiet heroes, with respect and gratitude and the understanding that some people leave the world better simply by being in it. Her funeral was small, attended by family, friends, and students whose lives she had touched. Doctor. Patel spoke, her voice steady despite the tears. Eleanor taught us that strength comes in many forms. She showed us that the greatest weapon is not violence but understanding, and she proved that even the quietest voice can change the world. The stone from Kravix was buried with her, placed in her hands. David made sure of it. He knew she would have wanted it close. Years later, when David joined her, their ashes were scattered in the great lawn of Central Park, where she had stood and faced the impossible. A small plaque was installed, simple and unadorned. It read, "Eleanor Marsh, Librarian Hero, the woman who won a war with a book." And in the vastness of space, on a quiet ship drifting through the stars, an old warlord who had once been a tyrant sat alone, reading. He had spent decades atoning, helping rebuild the worlds he had shattered, teaching others the lessons he had learned. And when he heard of Eleanor's passing, he paused, set his book aside, and whispered a single word into the silence. "Thank you." Eleanor's story became legend. It was taught in schools, adapted into films, retold in countless forms. But the truest version was the one carried by the people who had known her, the ones who understood that she had not been a warrior or a hero in the traditional sense. She had been a librarian, a translator, a quiet woman who had faced down a monster and chosen to heal instead of harm. And that choice had rippled across the universe, proving that the deadliest weapon was never held, it was read.